A severed head can remain conscious for up to 30 seconds after death. That was the rumor shared among executioners whispered in cells. Enough time for the eyes to blink, for lips to tremble, for the soul to realize what had been done to it. For Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, mother of the future Elizabeth there, that final window of consciousness was no longer an abstract horror. It was an impending certainty, and she knew it. If you enjoy immersive history, told with depth and detail, like this video and subscribe for more. The Tower of London did not sleep. Its stones breathed cold. The corridors held silence, not as absence, but as pressure. Within those walls, Anne moved like a revenant. Her skin pale, her mouth dry, yet her mind impossibly clear. She rehearsed, not for salvation, but for performance. The eyes of England would be upon her, as they always had been. She touched the back of her neck, the skin there, tender, almost tingling, as though anticipating cold steel. She asked the jailer again what kind of sword the executioner would use. French, double-edged, swift. A blade designed not for hacking, but for grace. As if death could be made elegant. In the Queen's final nights, the floor beneath her chamber was scrubbed more than usual. The guards who passed her cell kept their eyes low. Their silence was not out of pity. It was dread, the kind that comes from proximity to an approaching ghost. Anne noticed everything. The shifting glances, the sudden scent of burning pitch, the echo of distant footsteps rehearsals she realized for the procession. The tower rehearsed for death, just as she did. Her ladies wept in silence. She did not. They thought her mad when she laughed. But Anne was not mad. She was simply resolved. There was power in composure. And she would not let Henry or the world see her break. Outside, the scaffold was being raised, not of the axe, but of the sword. Henry had allowed this single mercy, a French executioner imported at cost. But even in this mercy, there was cruelty. Anne was told, days in advance. It wasn't meant to comfort her, it was meant to linger. Sleep eluded her. In the candlelit hours, she pressed her fingers to her pulse, still alive, still sovereign in her mind, if not in law. She prayed not for life, but for clarity, for the strength to speak without her voice trembling, for the poise to kneel without her legs giving way, for her final breath to carry words that would burn. And she wrote, to Henry, to her daughter, to no one. Ink soaked the page with a desperation that smelled of roses and rot. She remembered the pageants when the people cheered her name, when she rode into London crowned with lilies and gold, when the crowds believed in her, when she believed in herself. Now even her title had been stripped. No more queen, no more majesty, merely Anne. But Anne remembered. She remembered the warm musk of Henry's embrace, the intoxicating weight of his obsession, the way he looked at her like a lion before a feast, the way that same gaze later turned hollow. She remembered her miscarriages, each one another tolling bell, each one another crack in her crown, and now the bell would toll again, this time not for loss, but for her. She would die at 8:19, the executioner had said. A mourning death, merciful in its punctuality. But she would not close her eyes before the blade fell. She would see it coming. Anne rehearsed her posture, back straight, chin high, knees bent with dignity. She whispered the words she would say aloud, not of guilt, but of grace, not of vengeance, but of eternity. Let them call her a whore. Let them whisper witch. Let them believe she bewitched the king and bewitched the court and bewitched her own downfall. Let them. The blade would take her head, but not her memory. She would die exquisitely, so exquisitely that the world could not help but remember, even if they tried to erase her. Even if Henry ordered her name scrubbed from the records, her crest burned, her portraits removed from palace walls. Even if her daughter was shunned, her allies crushed her grave unmarked. Anne Boleyn would die in performance. And somewhere deep inside her, she hoped irrationally, desperately, that even Henry would remember. Not the accusations, not the charges, but the woman who once laughed beside him, who danced as if life itself bowed to her rhythm. A severed head can remain conscious for 30 seconds. Anne planned to fill every one. The court still smelled of lavender water rose oil and wax-polished floors, but beneath the perfume rot spread like a bruise across the skin of England. It clung to the tapestries, crept beneath the ermine, and curled in the corners of every chamber Anne had once graced. The courtiers smiled. They bowed. But they moved like dancers in a play, where the queen was already dead, and they had simply not yet delivered the final line. Anne walked among them in those final months, like a ghost who had not yet been buried. Her gowns still shimmered. Her voice still carried the lilt of a woman born to captivate. But no one met her eyes for long. Those who once showered her with flattery now studied the pattern of the floor or the weight of their own breath. For Anne's presence was no longer enchanting. It was dangerous, infectious. Proximity to her meant risking the king's rage, and Henry's love had a half-life measured in seasons. Even the courtiers she had raised, whose fortunes she had built with a glance, now turned inward. A shared silence passed between them, the kind shared by survivors of a shipwreck who are too afraid to speak of the sea. Anne knew. She always had a sharp sense for rot. Long before her body was betrayed, long before the court whispered of witchcraft and incest and treason, she had smelled the change. It wasn't sudden. No blade falls without first being sharpened. Henry had begun with coolness. A glance withheld a room departed 2 early nights, where his bed remained undisturbed by her warmth. Then came irritation, then distance, then rage disguised as policy. When Jane Seymour entered court, Anne recognized the script immediately. Jane was soft where she was sharp, pale where she was dark, submissive where she was fire. Henry did not love her, not really. He loved what she represented: silence, a return to order, a womb untainted by rebellion. Jane was the promise of obedience made flesh. Anne watched Henry watch Jane, and in that gaze she saw her death. The courtiers followed suit. They clung to Henry's moods like vines to a crumbling wall, and Anne, once the sun around which their ambitions revolved, became a black star, still burning, but cursed to collapse. She noticed the smallest betrayals: first a maid replaced without notice, a seal missing from a letter, the slow exclusion from Privy Council meetings. Then came the larger ones. George, her brother, her anchor summoned and questioned. Mark Smeaton trembling under forced confessions, names collected like kindling, and Henry, who once kissed the hem of her robe, now refused even to meet her eyes. She still dined in the great halls, still walked the gardens, still bore the weight of the crown in posture, if not in privilege. But the stares were not admiration, they were calculation. Everyone was waiting for the fall. Some already saw it as having happened. Her presence was merely the echo. Anne laughed once during a meal, a full bright laugh at a jest told by her fool. The sound froze the table. Forks paused mid-air. A silence bloomed that seemed to question who gave her permission to laugh. She finished her wine in that silence. Perfume only masks rot for so long. Anne took to burning incense in her chambers, not for worship, for defiance. Sandalwood, frankincense, myrrh. She soaked her sleeves in orange blossom and combed oils into her hair. If they would make her into a phantom, she would haunt them in sweetness. When Henry passed her in corridors, which he now did without word or warmth, she tilted her chin, forcing him to inhale what he had once craved. He looked away, jaw clenched, a man haunted by the scent of his own undoing. She had given him a son, once or nearly. The child lost in miscarriage, born too early to cry. A prince that never breathed. Henry had never forgiven her for the silence of that cradle. But Anne had given him more than blood. She had given him revolution. She was not Catherine, not obedient, not pliant. She had torn England from Rome with her own hands. She had whispered scripture into Henry's ear, rewritten the rules of queenship, turned marriage into war, and war into religion. And now she would be punished for it. Her enemies gathered in shadows, Cromwell chief among them. He who had once served her with bowed head now sharpened knives in policy. His hands never touched blood, but they moved the hands that did. And still Anne walked with grace, because to falter was to surrender. She knew the tide had turned. She knew her name was being unwritten even as she wore it. But Anne Boleyn was not bred for surrender. If they were to bury her alive in memory, she would make the grave fragrant. She appeared in court in white, unseasonal blinding white, as if to remind them of the body they would soon stain, pearls at her throat, crimson at her lips, eyes that refused to dim. She passed Jane in the hallway once, briefly, no words, just breath. Jane smelled of violets, soft and safe. Anne smiled. Perfume wears off. In the beginning, it was theater, a pageant of glances, letters, and rehearsed restraint. Anne Boleyn didn't give herself easily. That was the role, the uncatchable flame. She danced not just at court, but within the creases of the king's obsession, choreographing each pause, each refusal, until desire became doctrine. Henry played his part, the suffering poet, the steadfast suitor, the king torn between love and God. His letters bled longing, mine own sweetheart, he called her, for whom I suffer. But beneath the velvet words pulsed a darker rhythm possession, disguised as worship. When he finally had her, he would not just claim her body. He would sever kingdoms for her. Anne watched it unfold with the precision of someone who knew the stakes. Her family coached her the Boleyn ambition stitched into every hem of her dress. Her ascent was not accidental, it was a script, and she played it perfectly. But scripts once written do not protect the actor. When Henry broke from Rome, it wasn't for God, it was for Anne. When he made her queen, it wasn't for England, it was for his lust made holy. But lust, unlike love, has an expiry. And Anne's role was not written to last beyond the third act. She became queen in a coronation unlike any before, not merely anointed enthroned. In crimson velvet and gold, with incense rising and choirs thundering, she rode through London like a goddess remade. But even then, some eyes did not cheer. Whispers gathered like crows. The people murmured, usurper, witch, concubine. Her beauty had a sharpness they distrusted, eyes too dark, tongue too clever, laughter too bold. Anne was a woman in a man's script, and men do not like improvisation. Still she rewrote lines. She advocated for the poor. She funded scholars. She argued theology with bishops, matching them word for word. She didn't sit quietly beside the throne, she inhabited it. But power that doesn't come from God or blood is power that must constantly defend itself. Henry's love cooled in the way fires do when they're starved of oxygen and novelty. And with every child lost, Anne's role shrank. She became the failed vessel, the cracked chalice. Even her sharpness, once intoxicating, began to grate. Then came Jane, the perfect opposite. Jane Seymour, silent, blonde, obedient. She didn't rewrite Henry's lines, she repeated them. She didn't provoke, she soothed. And where Anne had forced the king into becoming legend, Jane promised a return to peace. And so the script changed. Anne, once the heroine, became the villain. The same charisma that had drawn Henry in now became evidence of seduction, manipulation, dark arts. Her intelligence became cunning. Her passion became hysteria. The script rewrote itself, and Cromwell held the pen. He had been her ally once, but ambition does not recognize loyalty, only proximity to power. Cromwell constructed the narrative, page by page, name by name. Mark Smeaton. The musician young Malleable terrified. Extracted confession. George Boleyn, her own brother, implicated. They were painted as lovers. It was obscene. And precisely because it was obscene, it was effective. The accusations were not meant to convince, they were meant to contaminate. Anne stood trial in a chamber heavy with heat and silence, not justice spectacle. The jurors wore velvet and indifference. Her own uncle sat among them, eyes fixed forward, mouth clenched in cowardice. She defended herself with eloquence that sliced. She answered every charge with clarity. But the verdict had been written before the trial began. The script no longer needed her voice. She was found guilty of adultery, incest, treason, words that in court held legal weight, but outside carried far more useful meanings, whore, poison, failure. And through it all, Henry said nothing. He let the performance proceed. From courtship to coronation to conviction, it had always been performance. Even his grief would later be performance. Anne understood. She always had. She had wielded performance as power, and now it was being turned against her. But she had one final act. Her death would be her own. She would not scream. She would not plead. She would not soil the image they wanted to burn. She would make her death unforgettable, not to preserve herself that was already lost, but to ruin their forgetting. In the final days, she dictated what she would wear, a dark gray gown, modest and severe. She would not be a painted whore in her last moments. She would be stone. She refused a priest's last rites, not out of rebellion, but because she had already made peace with a deeper truth that history was not written by the just, but by the survivors. And she was not meant to survive. So she would leave behind something deeper than survival performance, as defiance. They gave her the lines, but she would choose the delivery. She rehearsed them. I die, the king's faithful servant. She knew it was a lie. She knew it would satisfy the crowd. But in her heart, she whispered the truth, I die, because I would not be quiet. The scaffold awaited. There was nothing organic in her downfall. No chaotic explosion, no spontaneous revolt. Anne Boleyn's execution was not born of rage, it was engineered. Treason was not discovered. It was constructed. Like a physician with a scalpel, Thomas Cromwell dissected Anne's world with deliberate precision. Each incision carefully placed. Each accusation chosen not for truth, but for effect. The charges had to be grotesque. Ordinary betrayal was not enough. Anne had been a queen, a consecrated vessel. To justify her public execution, she could not simply have failed. She had to be monstrous. And so the script demanded exaggeration, adultery, incest, sorcery. The anatomy of treason begins not with guilt, but with silence. Anne's allies were stripped of voice. Her enemies were given room to speak and paid to do so. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, was the first to fall. Soft-featured, talented, and vulnerable. He was summoned, questioned, then vanished. When he reappeared, he confessed not once, but many times, with frightening specificity. Dates, locations, glances shared, touches imagined. They said he had been tortured, though Cromwell denied it. Yet when he emerged from questioning, his hands trembled as if they no longer belonged to him. Then came Sir Henry Norris, Anne's former admirer, and the king's own friend. He denied all. But denial means nothing in a play where the ending has already been rehearsed. Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, names that mattered once. Now props. Supporting cast in a tragedy that required their deaths. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, her brother. The most shocking charge of all. Incest. The word rotted in the air like spoiled meat. It was not believed by many even then. But it didn't need to be believed. It needed to be possible. And in possibility the prosecution found power. The trial was a grotesque inversion of law. The evidence poetry gestures conversations months apart. Smeaton's confessions inconsistent and absurd. No eyewitnesses, no solid proof. But the charges were designed to horrify, not to hold. Anne stood accused of bewitching the king. They claimed she had used charm spells and unnatural seduction to ensnare him, that her miscarriages were a punishment from God, that the boy she lost had been malformed, a sign of sin. None of it needed verification. In Tudor England, disgust could be legal proof. The jurors sat like wax figures, men who owed their titles, their fortunes, or their silence to Cromwell or to Henry himself. The outcome had been decided long before Anne entered the courtroom, but still she entered with poise. Witnesses lied beneath tapestries. Evidence was rewritten in ink that hadn't dried. And yet Anne's voice never quavered. She refused to plead for mercy. She answered the incest charge with biting clarity. "If any man accuses me, let him speak now." None did. She stared her judges down, her uncle among them, eyes dead. Men who had once courted her favor now refused to meet her gaze. The court was not a trial. It was a ritual. Each word spoken not for truth, but for cleansing. Not of Anne, but of the guilt the king could not bear. If Anne was guilty, then Henry was not a murderer, but a deliverer. If Anne was wicked, then the break from Rome had been righteous. If Anne had bewitched him, then he had never truly sinned. That was the real script, the deeper one. Beneath the charges, beneath the names, was the machinery of absolution, and Cromwell was the surgeon. He cut clean, removed Anne from history with surgical finality. Her portraits disappeared from walls, her motto erased from coins, her initials chiseled from stone. Even her servants were dismissed, interrogated, exiled. Her world dismantled, piece by piece. George was tried the next day. He too refused to bend. He mocked the charges. He laughed in court. But when the sentence came even, he fell silent. Anne never saw him again. In the days that followed, the tower shifted. The guards softened. The ladies attending her began to weep openly. Even her enemies looked away. Because the machinery of erasure, once in motion, leaves a residue, and even those who benefit from its work can smell the iron in the air. Henry had already moved on. Jane Seymour was installed at court, kept hidden, but groomed for queenship. A new era prepared before the blood had even dried. Anne felt it not just the betrayal, but the precision of it. Every step, every silence, every glance had been calibrated. This was not chaos. This was architecture. Anne was not condemned for being faithless. She was condemned for being formidable. A woman who had taken the stage and rewritten her part. Now the state would correct her. They would carve her name out of history, just as they carved her body from life. But Anne's eyes on that final evening were not the eyes of a broken woman. They were not the eyes of guilt. They were the eyes of someone who understood her death better than her accusers did. She was not being killed for adultery. She was being killed for daring to matter. The morning was pale and bitter. A flat, sickly light spilled over the tower green, turning every surface ghost-colored the stone, the scaffold, even the faces in the crowd. There was no breeze, no bird song. The air held a wrongness like breath caught in a dying throat. Anne Boleyn rose early. She had slept little, if at all. Her ladies helped her dress in silence, hands trembling as they laced her gown. It was a simple dress, dark gray damask trimmed in black. No jewels, no color, no crown. The Queen of England would die draped in mourning, not for herself, but for the role that had already been stripped from her. She requested a coif to cover her hair, the dark silk pulled back tightly to expose her neck. Not vanity preparation. The French sword was sharp, yes, but it demanded clarity of target. Anne would leave nothing to chance. She would die with the elegance expected of her. But she would also die on her own terms. She refused shoes. The soft leather slippers lay untouched. Instead, she descended from her chamber barefoot. the only sound the hush of silk brushing the stones, her steps barely more than breath. Outside, the crowd waited. Gentlemen, soldiers, merchants, foreign ambassadors. They had come to witness the unmaking of a queen. Some came to confirm her guilt, others her innocence. Most came simply to remember what it looked like when power collapsed in public. The scaffold loomed dressed in fresh straw to soak the blood. It reeked of prior deaths, not just physical, reputational, symbolic, historical. Anne approached it like an actress to a final monologue. Measured, composed, yet beneath her poise the flesh trembled. She mounted the steps slowly, her eyes scanning the horizon, not for rescue, but for meaning. The tower bell had not yet rung. The executioner waited nearby, his blade hidden beneath the folds of his cloak as tradition required. His hands were clean, his eyes unreadable. A small wind lifted then, finally, and carried the scent of smoke charcoal from the kitchens, or perhaps from something older. The scent of endings. Anne reached the top of the scaffold. She turned to the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was soft and clear. It did not shake. Not even once. Good Christian people I am, come hither to die. Her final speech was short, crafted, polished to perfection. She declared her innocence not of the charges, but of malice. She praised the king, called him gentle, said she prayed for him. Lies, yes, but necessary ones. Words spoken not to reflect truth, but to preserve her daughter's future. It was a woman's last act of statecraft. Her ladies stood at the base of the scaffold, already sobbing. Anne had instructed them not to follow her up. No one would see her break. No one would see her body tremble as she knelt. She adjusted her skirts, smoothed the fabric beneath her knees, and whispered her final prayer. "Jesu, receive my soul." The swordsman stepped forward. French, elegant, imported like silk, efficient like steel. He called for his assistant to fetch the sword, a trick to distract her. While her gaze shifted toward the supposed movement, he moved silently behind her. She did not see the blade. It sang through the air with the softness of breath and the weight of inevitability. And then silence. No scream, no gasp, no clatter. Only the fall of a body that had once commanded kings' rewritten scripture birthed empires in flesh and fear. Her head landed gently in the straw. Her eyes were open. Some said she blinked. Some said her lips moved. A priest wept into his sleeve. A lady fainted. A pigeon, startled from its perch, took off into the pale sky. The crowd did not cheer. They exhaled. A release. Not relief. Not joy. Just the end of a held breath. A silence that devoured everything: her voice, her memory, her presence. Her body was removed swiftly, wrapped in coarse linen, placed in an arrow chest because no coffin had been prepared. Buried beneath the altar of the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, unmarked, unblessed, unfinished. No procession, no monument, no requiem, just silk and ashes. The scaffold was scrubbed, the blood rinsed with lye. By afternoon, it looked as if no one had died there at all. By evening, the king was celebrating. He wore yellow, the color of mourning in Spain, but of celebration in England. A convenient ambiguity. He rode out with Jane Seymour days later. His eyes were bright. His conscience, if it spoke, did so behind locked doors. But the tower remembered. Its walls had held her last breath. Its stones had felt her barefoot descent. Its scaffold had drunk her blood, and somewhere in the deep of that English morning history had shifted. A queen had died. But not just died, performed. Not just silenced, staged. Not just ended, erased. They said the head blinked. Not once. Twice. Maybe more. Eyewitnesses differed, but all remembered the horror. The blade had been clean, the stroke precise, but the body does not always obey the dignity of design. The mind lingers. The muscles twitch. Blood pulses once more, just enough for the soul to hesitate. Anne's face in death was serene, they said. But her eyelids fluttered, her lips parted slightly as if to speak. Some believed she mouthed her final prayer again. "Jesu, receive my soul." Others whispered that she had tried to say her daughter's name. Elizabeth. In that moment, the moment after the blade, time fractured. A woman no longer living remained somehow present. Her body already limp in the straw, her face turned slightly sideways, her eyes holding on. The crowd did not know how to look. Some stared, transfixed. Others turned away. No one clapped. No one jeered. The silence was thick not with mourning, but with awe. The kind that settles when death does something it is not supposed to do. The executioner stepped back, sword dripping. He bowed to the body not out of respect, but out of fear. For a breathless moment, it seemed Anne Boleyn had transcended the spectacle of her own ending. Her presence clung to the scaffold like vapor. Her ladies moved to her remains. Quietly, deliberately. One wrapped her head in cloth. Another cradled her torso, as if still afraid to disturb her. They said her skin was still warm. Her blood ran into the straw and beneath it stone. Cold, wet, red seeping into gray. The tower drank deeply. It had known many executions, but this was not just a beheading. It was the murder of memory in real time. That was the part no one wanted to admit. Anne was not merely killed. She was transitioned, from presence to absence, from sovereign to stain, from flesh to ghost. The crowd dispersed by mid-morning, quietly, like mourners who weren't allowed to grieve. The air still tasted of metal. Children were hurried away. Foreign dignitaries took notes they would later burn or conceal. And the English court moved on as though a play had ended, the curtain drawn, and the actors dismissed. Henry did not attend. He had gone hawking at dawn. When the blade fell, he was miles away smiling as a falcon returned to his glove. He asked no questions. He issued no eulogy, only an order that her name never be spoken again. Inside the tower, the linens were burned, the coif discarded. Her final letters, if they existed, were sealed or destroyed. Her book of hours disappeared. Her portraits were taken down, her likeness scraped from stone. Seals shattered, signatures removed. It was not just execution, it was excision. History, like the body, has nerves. When something is violently removed, it leaves behind an ache, a phantom limb of memory. And though the state tried to cauterize her existence, Anne Boleyn lingered. She lingered in whispers, in dreams, in quiet rage passed down between women. The sword that struck her was sheathed and returned to France, but its echo remained. The court felt it in the walls, in the shifting glances, in the silence that filled every chamber Anne had once entered. Even Jane Seymour felt it, though she would never say it aloud. She moved through Anne's former apartments like a guest in a haunted house, the smell of lavender still hidden in the drapes. Her silence was survival. For days after the execution, a damp mist clung to London. The Thames moved slower. The bells rang duller. It was as if the world had taken in Anne's final breath and was now holding it unsure what to do next. Her body, once admired, adored, and feared, lay in an unmarked grave. No monument bore her name, no epitaph carved, just earth and the faint memory of silk once worn. But memory is not so easily killed. Anne had once told her ladies that she feared being forgotten more than being damned. That death meant little if one's name survived. Yet now that name was being buried beside her, not just in soil, but in time. The royal court stopped speaking of her. Her daughter was left without mention of her mother for years. Schoolbooks omitted her reign. The church referred to her only as the concubine. Even in Henry's private papers she vanished. Only Elizabeth's small, watchful fatherless, in truth, seemed to hold her mother in the silence between lessons. She grew in shadow, but she grew. The sword had fallen. The head had blinked. But the death was not yet complete, because something in Anne had refused to close her eyes, refused to silence her lips, refused to let death end her, not entirely. There are deaths that finish, and there are deaths that echo. Anne Boleyn's death was the latter. The moment after the blade was not an ending. It was the beginning of her erasure, and of her return. No one sang at her burial, no priest offered final words, no crowds gathered. The woman who had once been crowned with golden roses, who had reshaped England's altar and throne, was laid to rest, like a criminal, hurried hidden and headless. The box wasn't even a coffin. It had once held arrows lined in splinters stained with oil and resin. Her body, hastily wrapped in coarse linen, didn't fit. The head was placed beside her. Her ladies, still trembling from the scaffold, lowered her in silence. It was over in minutes. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, St. Peter in chains, bore her now. Irony without justice. A queen buried beneath a chapel named for confinement. Her grave was unmarked. No stone, no words, just a patch of flagstone that looked like every other. And yet, that stone pulsed, not with holiness, with theft. A queen had been stolen from history. Back in the palace, Henry removed all traces. Her crest, the falcon atop a Tudor rose, was struck from carvings. Tapestries depicting her coronation were pulled down. Letters bearing her signature were sealed in private archives or destroyed outright. Her motto, "The Most Happy," was replaced by silence. Servants were reassigned. Those who had dressed her prayed with her, wept for her gone. Replaced with Jane Seymour's quiet maids, who knew better than to ask questions. They swept the rooms with the care of those tending a graveyard. The king never spoke her name again, not once. To the court it was as if Anne Boleyn had never existed. To Elizabeth, barely a toddler, her mother became a ghost the world refused to name. She would not see a portrait of her mother until she was nearly a woman. Even then, it was a hidden thing, a likeness kept in secret by those who remembered. But memory was dangerous, for those who remembered were also marked. Her supporters were watched, her family shunned, her daughter's legitimacy questioned for years, a stain that no crown could wash away. Anne's destruction was not just physical, it was systemic. To erase her completely, they had to make her name unspeakable. And yet she remained. She clung in odd places in the corners of forgotten manuscripts, in the fading sketches tucked inside family chests, in the dreams of women who had once knelt before her. Her voice echoed in the halls she once walked in, the prayers whispered by maids who had dared to love her. They said a white falcon was seen above the tower the night she died, that it circled once and vanished. A sign, or perhaps guilt feathered and circling. The erasure wasn't perfect. It never is, because history does not forget. It delays. The tomb remained unmarked for centuries. Visitors to the chapel stepped over her without knowing. But beneath that stone, she waited not for resurrection, but for recognition. Even the stone itself could not lie forever. In time, the records returned, slowly, reluctantly. First through rumor, then scholarship. A queen beneath the chapel floor, executed, disgraced, forgotten, but not lost, never lost, because power can silence for a season, but not forever. Anne Boleyn had walked too brightly. She had spoken too clearly. She had mattered too much to vanish entirely. And so the earth remembered. The crown did not. Henry remarried. Then again, and again. The body that had once burned for Anne grew heavy with disease. He aged into a grotesque monument of gluttony and regret. The man who had torn down heaven to have her could not look his own daughter in the eye without remembering the cost. He never visited the tower again. It was too close, too loud with silence, too full of stones that whispered her name. At court, when her name was spoken, if ever it was in shadows behind doors. A cautionary tale, a warning, a ghost story told in whispers by candlelight. Be careful whom the king loves. Be careful whom the king tires of. Be careful if your crown is made of breath. Anne's tomb bore no inscription, but it bore witness. To the mechanics of erasure, to the fragility of queenship, to the way history kneels to the victors and trembles before the dead. She had dreamed once of a great legacy, not just for herself, but for her child, and they had tried to deny her even that. But legacy, like blood, has a way of seeping through stone. Anne had been buried without name, but her daughter would take that name and wear it on a crown, and through Elizabeth Anne would rise again, not as a queen, as the mother of a monarch who could not be erased. The stone still bore no words, but the silence above it began to change. Not forgetfulness, reverence. They killed her twice, first in flesh, the body made spectacle, the breath silenced the eyes stilled by steel. Then, in memory, the name cut from the ledger, the portrait scraped from the wall, the voice edited from the annals of kings. The second death was slower, more meticulous, less visible, and far more dangerous, because to kill the body is one thing. To kill the truth is another. Anne Boleyn's real execution wasn't complete on the scaffold. It continued in every word not written about her, in every record falsified, in every history that named her only as the concubine, or worse, not at all. She was not just erased, she was replaced. Her enemies rewrote the script. Anne the Queen became Anne the Witch. Anne the Martyr became Anne the Seductress. The thinking woman became the dangerous one. The ambitious woman, the unnatural one. Her legacy reshaped not by what she did, but by what men feared she had the power to do. And they wrote it down. Cromwell's machinery worked. The king's will was law. The church stayed silent. And posterity, eager to please, eager to simplify, repeated the lie until the lie became canon. Even centuries later, her story is told through those distortions. The Six Wives narrative. The hysterical woman. The curse of ambition. But those aren't stories. They're scripts. And Anne Boleyn's life, her real life, defies the script. She was not merely a wife. She was an architect of rupture. She was not merely a victim. She was a strategist, a scholar, a voice that challenged papal power and marital politics alike. She was not executed for adultery. She was executed for being consequential. In a world where women were meant to adorn, she acted. Where they were meant to obey, she resisted. Where they were meant to reflect the crown, she shaped it. And for that, she had to be unmade. This wasn't just Tudor justice. This was narrative control. And it echoes still. Because every time a powerful woman is rewritten, flattened into villain or lover, hysteric or fool, Anne dies again. Every time history simplifies a woman into one thing, mother, mistress, traitor, muse, Anne's blood darkens the flagstones anew. Her death is not past tense. It is precedent. It teaches us what happens when power controls the pen. When the state not only executes, but curates. When those in control can determine not only who dies, but how they are remembered. Anne's story warns us when memory becomes a monarchy, truth is always the first to fall. Yet she endures, not because history was kind, but because history cracked. And through those cracks her eyes still watch. They watch from the stained glass of forgotten chapels, from the margins of letters unsigned, from the lips of her daughter who would grow into the Virgin Queen, a woman who ruled alone, who wore her crown with silence and steel, who never married, who never forgot. Elizabeth did not speak often of her mother, but she carried her ghost like armor. Anne's true monument is not in stone. It is in every question that refuses to fade. In every retelling that peels back propaganda. In every reader, listener, woman, or daughter who hears the name Anne Boleyn and asks, Who was she really? Her story ends not with the blade. It ends here with you, reading, remembering, refusing to let her vanish. Because when the state kills a body, it hopes for silence. But when the state tries to kill memory, it fears witnesses. You are that witness now. Let the record show. Anne Boleyn was not just executed, she was erased. And then she returned,